Welcome to the third video in the series. In this video, I'll be going through my third week of training for this mesocycle, which turned out to be the last hard training week of the mesocycle. I wound up having to cut the mesocycle 1 week short because I had plans to go on holidays to London for a few days, and furthermore, training fatigue was getting quite high, and I had reached roughly the level of conditioning and or leanness that I wanted to by this point in prep. I was aiming to be around 96, 97 kilograms, around 11 to 12% body fat, and I roughly reached that now. And so I think it makes sense for me to cut my mesocycle 1 week short and start the mesocycle in a week from now, the next one. So I'll be spending following this deload week, I'll be spending the next 6 weeks in a slight mass phase, aiming to gain around a kilogram to maybe 1.5 kilograms, so nothing crazy. Still trying to minimize fat gain so it doesn't make the rest of prep any more difficult. I'll be specializing on chest and arm growth, so that includes biceps, triceps, and forearms. I would say for my physique specifically, my stronger body parts tend to be my legs, sort of excluding my calves. My calves are okay, not good, but not terrible either. And calves generally don't contribute that much to a physique compared to other body parts. And so my legs are generally a pretty strong area, my back as well. But my chest and arms, my shoulders are about as good as my back, I'd say. But then my chest and arms are where my physique is probably the weakest. And so I spoke about this with some friends, with some coaches, with Dr. Mike as well. And overall, it does seem like the area that needs the most improvement for my physique to be at its best would be chest and arms. And so for the next 6 weeks, I'll be specializing on chest and arms, including forearms. I think the reason why my chest and arms are my weakest body parts and why my legs and back are my strongest body parts is because when I started training, as I previously mentioned, I believe, I didn't really focus on training my chest and arms very much. I mostly just focused on training my back and legs because, well, I just found it more fun, and I thought hard training equaled to good training, and training back and legs was the hardest training there was compared to training chest and arms. And so that's what I mostly stuck to. And also at the time I played basketball, and so that was more helpful than training like arms or what have you. So in this session you can actually see me training in a different gym. I trained in a more powerlifting centric gym. But yeah, by this point in prep, in the mesocycle, what have you, I was quite fatigued, and so yeah, I was feeling it. Hunger-wise, it's not been too bad. It's been quite manageable. I've begun introducing some low and high calorie days via lower and higher amounts of carbs. The evidence on refeeds, I wasn't particularly convinced to it prior to seeing the latest Jeff Nippard video. I'd seen the studies individually in MASS, which is monthly applications in strength sports, which is essentially a research review that comes out every month about studies in bodybuilding, powerlifting, most things related to lifting weights. And so I'd seen the individual studies in MASS, and overall it just seemed like it didn't really make much of a difference. But looking at the evidence as a whole, by looking at the latest Jeff Nippard video, it does seem like, at the very least, it's probably not inferior, and it might be slightly better for some things in certain circumstances. And so I'm now willing to consider it a bit more, which I guess is what evidence-based practice is all about, which is revising your views as you become aware of more evidence and you learn more and more about what the truth likely is. So yeah, I'm going to start playing around with higher calorie days and lower calorie days via more carbs and fewer carbs. I'm not going to apply refeeds in the more traditional sense of having 1 or 2 refeed days per week. I'll be applying them in a more having higher and lower carb days for training and non-training days specifically. So because you're training, because on days you're training, you're expending more calories and specifically likely depleting muscle glycogen to an extent, it makes sense to have more carbs in those days to aid with recovery. Specifically after exercising is when exercising being stuff like walking as well, basically anything that really depletes muscle glycogen, so walking, running, lifting weights as well. Lifting weights doesn't deplete that much muscle glycogen, but it does deplete it to an extent, and if you want to optimize recovery between sessions, especially if you're doing AM PM sessions, and thus adaptations, because if you're not well recovered, your performance in the next session is going to suffer, and if your performance in the next session suffers, then your stimulus will also suffer, so the stimulus you get from that session is going to be worse, which then over time can lead to worse gains than if you were properly recovered between sessions. So even though it might seem like a small detail, during prep, and especially when doing higher volumes and doing AM PM sessions, recovering as much muscle glycogen between sessions as possible can be a fairly important detail. And so I'm going to start playing around with lower and higher calorie days and see how that goes. Specifically, I'll probably be sticking around 2,000 to 2,200 calories on non-training days, and then on training days, which is 5 days of the week most of the time, I'll be doing around 3,600 calories, which overall should average out to around 3,000 calories per day, 3,100 calories per day, which for me has been sufficient to lose nearly 1% of body weight a week, which for me is around 1 kilogram. And yeah, it's been pretty good. Now you can see me training at that other gym again. I was training there because some friends were training and I joined them for this session. They have some cool equipment, like they have a camel bar, which is a big favorite of mine for both bent over rowing and for benching. I find for benching it sort of gives you a really good stretch, and while still being wide grip. One issue people can sometimes run into with closer grip bench is while it does enhance range of motion for triceps, front delts, and chest if done properly, it can sometimes be limited by tricep or front delt strength, which probably isn't ideal because the bench doesn't really grow your tricep or front delts that well. If you look at direct studies on bench pressing, for example, where they assess muscle growth in different muscle groups, it does seem like the triceps and front delts don't really grow that well from benching, whereas the chest does. And so I think typically, if you're going to bench, do it for the aim of growing your chest, not so much your triceps and front delts. And so why I like the cambered bar bench press is because with wide grip, it's typically easier to reach failure for your chest because of the way the moment arms are set up. And the wide grip also, in this case, doesn't constrain range of motion that much because of the cambered bar. And so you get a deep stretch, and that's quite nice. You can see some vascularity coming through now, slowly. Prior to this prep and this cut right now, I hadn't really ever seen much vascularity in my physique. And I think that mostly comes down to A, perhaps not having the best genetics for vascularity at higher body fat percentages, and B, mostly, that's like by and large the biggest reason, I just wasn't as lean as I thought. And that's something I mentioned back in the first episode of this series, where I think beginners to bodybuilding often make the mistake of thinking they are much leaner than they are. And so I think that was also something I did, but I'm, I think, getting increasingly better at telling how fat I am, or lean, hopefully. So right now, my body weight's around 97.5 kilograms, which in pounds equals to around, I want to say 215 pounds. And my body fat is likely around 12-13%, which I'm pretty happy with. Hopefully it should only be around 7 to 8 more kilograms of weight loss until I hit stage weight, which in pounds is again maybe 16 to 18 pounds. And I have 20 weeks left. So again, I'll be spending the next 6 weeks in a specialization phase in a slight mass for my chest and arms, and then I'll be spending the remaining, I'll be spending 2 weeks in maintenance and then the remaining 12 weeks of prep in a deficit to get stage lean. Anyways, you can see me doing sissy squats here. Again, I mentioned this in the last video, but I think they're good because they place a lot of tension on the quads in a full stretch, which you don't get from leg extensions, and having a lot of tension in a more lengthened position of the muscle group is likely pretty good for muscle growth. And yeah, these are quite hard. If you have a sissy squat bench, I think that's probably better for stability purposes, but I can be pretty stable like this by anchoring my hand onto a nearby object and sort of using it for stabilization should I need it. I guess one key is not to use it for actually pulling yourself up, which requires you to be a little bit honest with yourself, but I'm pretty good usually with staying strict, so it's not really an issue for me. Anyways, then I moved on to some leg curls. You can see me doing lying leg curls here, and different machines really have different weights on here, as with all machines. And so one thing I see people worry about a lot is having different gym memberships or having to travel and having to use different machines. And fundamentally, I sort of get it because it makes tracking progression a little bit more difficult. But as long as you're not switching gyms every session, I think tracking progression can be fine. Let's say you're traveling 1 out of 5 weeks to a different gym. For those 4 weeks, just track your performance as you usually would, with the same machines, same weights and everything. And then for that 1 week you're away, for holidays let's say, just aim to get the same rep ranges as usual and aim to go as close to failure as usual. And while the weight on the stack may not be the same, the stimulus you impose for muscle growth should be pretty comparable, because your muscle isn't any weaker at that new gym than it was at the old gym. And so as long as the rep range is similar, the effort or proximity to failure is similar, the stimulus you impose for muscle growth is going to be pretty similar as well. And if you're only going to be at that gym once, I wouldn't worry too much about writing down the weights you used because it's not really that useful. You could argue you should keep doing it for habit formation of just, tracking your training in general, and that's a valid point. But if you don't, it's not a huge deal, I think. However, if you do go back to that gym pretty often, like let's say you have a second gym you attend half the time you're training, or you plan on going back to it periodically, like for example, I'm from Belgium, and so when I go back to Belgium, there are a few gyms I tend to go to, and I trained there when I was 16, 17 as well. And so going back there now, with the data I have from back then, it's kind of cool because I can use the same machines as back then and sort of see, okay, I haven't used the machines in a while, so I'm not technically very proficient with them. But by going back there and seeing how the performance changed, I can see, okay, I did get quite a bit bigger or strong, what have you. And so I think that can be useful as well if you do have gyms that you go back to periodically or fairly often. But if you only go there every now and again, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Someone in comments last week asked me about my measurements, which I guess I'll address measurements as a whole first. I don't think measurements are that useful overall as a standalone measure. They can be kind of useful in conjunction with stuff like body weight, performance in compound exercises or isolation exercises over months and months, and pictures. They can be a decent add-on to those measurements, but I think body part circumferences, like how big are your arms, how big are your legs, thighs, calves, what have you, aren't that useful. The reason is, unless you're trained to take measurements, there is too much measurement error. So measurement error is whenever you take a measurement of something, there's a certain range of error you have by taking that measurement because you're not perfectly trained, conditions are slightly different. Just every time you take a measurement, you might be off by a couple percent. And so let's say your true arm measurement is 16 inches, like in my case for now. Sometimes you might take a measurement and be like, oh, it's 15.5 inches, and sometimes it might be 16.5. And so when you consider that, and you consider that muscle growth occurs very slowly, on a scale of weeks or months, typically measurement error is just bigger than the actual changes you're trying to measure. And so unless you're taking a lot of measurements to sort of average out that measurement error, it can be difficult to tell apart actual change in muscle size from measurement error. And so I'm not a huge fan of tape measurements for body part circumference and that sort of thing. One area I think they can be a bit more useful is for waist circumference. Waist circumference can serve as a decent proxy for body fat percentage in both men and women, probably more so in men because of the way men store body fat. But yeah, that's a bit more of a decent measure because typically people don't experience a ton of muscle growth in that area, but it is an area where people store a lot of body fat. And so, yeah, I think measuring your waist circumference can be a bit more useful for assessing body fat percentage. Now, I'll answer the question the commenter asked last week, which was, oh, what are your measurements? And they asked specifically about my arms, my thighs, and my calves. So my calves and arms are both 16 inches at this point in prep. Arms are flexed, calves unflexed, all with no pump. So I've lost a little bit of fat mass across my arms and calves over this prep, I think. And then my thighs at the largest point again are around 66, 67 centimeters, which in inches, if I had to make the conversion in my head right now, would be around 25 inches, I think. That sounds about right. Actually, no, that doesn't sound right at all, does it? About 26, 27 inches, something like that. You can do the conversion if you care enough. So yeah, I'm looking forward to a deload week now. I have switched a lot of my food choices to more satiating choices. So I think something not many people speak about with regards to carb intake during prep, or just in general actually, even when just considering weight loss, is the continuum from higher GI, so glycemic index, carbs that have less fiber typically, and that are less satiating and more calorie dense, to carbs that are less calorie dense, have a lower GI, so glycemic index, higher fiber, and are less calorically dense. Typically, you'll want carbs that are less calorically dense, higher fiber, lower GI, and less calorie dense when you're hungry, because they tend to serve the role of hunger management a bit better. So they tend to be more satiating, and so you can eat more of them for any amount of calories you have. And those can be really useful during prep, for example, or during weight loss, and typically farther away from training sessions. But then during a mass phase where you're trying to get in more calories and hunger might be an issue insofar as you don't have enough hunger to meet your calorie needs, in that situation, higher GI, lower fiber, higher calorie carbs can be more useful. And so I think typically your carb intake sources, so like your food sources, whether it be salad versus white rice versus sweet potatoes versus regular potatoes, those choices, if your main goal is just body composition and you don't have much of a regard for taste or convenience, your main consideration there should probably be replenishing glycogen after a session, and that's best done with lower fiber carbs with higher GIs, glycemic indexes. That's after a session, within a few hours after a session. And then B, considering hunger. And so during a prep, that typically means sticking to higher fiber carb sources, lower GI carb sources, less calorie dense carb sources, that sort of thing. And I think you can sort of view your carb source choices, so where your carbs come from, whether it's white rice, sweet potato, and so forth, depending on where you fall in terms of hunger. If you're very hungry, stick to less calorie dense, higher fiber, lower GI carbs, mostly. But if you're less hungry, then you can stick to mostly higher GI carbs, more calorie dense, and so forth. And so really, what you should be trying to do is match your hunger, or match your carb sources to your hunger. And I think that's a very good approach for managing hunger overall. If you're interested in the sort of topic of hunger management during prep, but also during weight loss, I did write a brief article on my website, which is Wolf Coaching, so wolf, like the animal, which is my last name, coaching.net. And in that article called, I think, Hunger Management Strategies, I basically just go over some evidence-based tips to manage your hunger using food during prep. And so I think that could be useful for a lot of people. It's some basic stuff, but typically the things I mentioned with carb sources, getting your deficit mostly through NEAT, and stuff like protein can be a bit more satiating on a calorie-to-calorie basis than other macronutrients. And so yeah, and some other tips as well. So if you'd like to check that out, I'll put the link in the description. Anyways, that about wraps up this video. If you enjoyed it, as always, please do comment, like, subscribe. I know everyone says that, and I kind of hate myself for saying it, but it does help out the channel. And yeah, I'll try and keep making these weekly for the next 15 to 20 weeks. I've been quite busy recently with coaching stuff. As you've seen, I began my internship with Dr. Mike Israetel over in Renaissance Periodization. But once that settles down and calms down a little bit, I can hopefully look into making other videos as well. Anyways, thank you for supporting, and I'll see you again next week.